Good evening, everyone. This is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. Sorry it's taken me so long to get this episode up, but it has been a busy time for me at work, so I have had quite a lot on my hands. But it is finally done. Episode 4, Researching Your Civil War Ancestor. Specifically, we're going to be talking about tonight the Grand Army of the Republic, the Union Veterans Organization. And most people don't think of Union Army in conjunction with Mississippi. The Confederate armies and men that served from the state are much better known, but there were a large number of men from the state that served in the Union Army during the Civil War. There were over 17,000 African Americans that served in United States colored troop regiments during the war, and then there were also sizable numbers of white Mississippians that served in the Union Army as well. Numbers are hard to come by, but I would guesstimate it's probably somewhere between 1 and 2,000. Most of them serving in units from other states, so they're a bit more difficult to track down. But tonight we're going to be talking about how you can research your relative who may have been a member of the Grand Army of the Republic. And this picture that I used for the title card is one of my favorites. There are not a lot of pictures of JR posts in Mississippi, but this is one of them. This is a photograph probably taken in the 1880s or early 1890s of a JR post in Natchez. Unfortunately, it's not identified. We don't know which one it is, and there were several in Natchez, but this is one of the Grand Army of the Republic posts in the city of Natchez, Mississippi. And shown here on the left is the Grand Army of the Republic membership medal. Almost every Union veteran would have worn this that was a member of the GAR. This was their badge, and they wore it because it was a very honorable symbol to them. On the right here is a photograph taken in Port Gibson, Mississippi, celebrating Freedom Day in 1890. These are the members of the GAR in Port Gibson, along with their female counterparts, the Women's Relief Corps. And again, I love this picture. This is one of, again, very few GAR pictures that are identified to the state of Mississippi. And I wish there were more, and maybe some more will turn up one day. But for now, the picture I just showed you previously and this one are two of the only known photographs of JAR posts in the state of Mississippi. Now, there are pictures of individual members that pop up from time to time, but group shots of an entire post, those are extremely rare. And if you ever come across one, please let me know about it, because I would love to see it. And just to give you a little background on what the GAR was, the GAR, or Grand Army of the Republic, was founded in Decatur, Illinois in April 6, 1866 by Benjamin F. Stevenson, and its membership was limited to honorably discharged veterans of the Union Army, Navy, Marine Corps, or the Revenue Cutter Service who served between April 12, 1861 and April 9, 1865. At the local level, the organization was called a post, and each was numbered consecutively within its department. Most posts also had names. They were usually named after a local hero of the war or a very well-known national personality, a general, or Abraham Lincoln, or some other very well-known Civil War figure. Post commanders were elected, as were the junior and senior vice commanders, who also helped to run the post. Each member was voted in by the membership using the Masonic system of casting black or white balls. White was acceptance, black was rejection. And to give you an idea, this is a Grand Army of the Republic membership certificate that would have been given to the member when he was initiated into the Grand Army of the Republic. And shown here in the inset is a picture of Dr. Benjamin F. Stevenson, who was the founder of the Grand Army of the Republic. He served as a surgeon in the 14th Illinois Infantry during the war, and interestingly enough, he first got the idea to create the Grand Army of the Republic while he was serving as part of Sherman's force that was marching on Meridian, Mississippi in 1864. So the idea for the Grand Army of the Republic was germinated in the state of Mississippi. Now, as I said before, when a veteran joined the Grand Army of the Republic, they became a member of a local post. These posts were often named after the city or town where they were located, or they were named after a prominent Civil War personage. And unfortunately, there are no surviving post halls in the state of Mississippi. Very often, the local post would build their own specific structure to have their meetings in. And I've taken a picture of a surviving GAR hall that is in the state of South Carolina. Unfortunately, there are no surviving GAR halls in the state of Mississippi as far as I know. Now, some GAR halls never built their own specific buildings. Some rented space in office buildings, but every GAR post would have had some designated area where they had their meetings. Yeah, this particular post was built in 1896 in South Carolina, and any purpose-built GAR hall in Mississippi probably would have looked something similar. And the Grand Army of the Republic was first established in Mississippi in 1870 with the creation of the Department of Mississippi, and it was commanded by Jonathan Tarble, who was the department commander. This early iteration of the Grand Army of the Republic didn't last very long. It only basically lasted as long as Reconstruction did. When Reconstruction ended, most of the membership who were Union Army regulars left the state, and these early posts, there were only two, one in Jackson and one in Vicksburg, and they were both white posts. They only had white members. They both folded up and ceased to exist by probably the mid-1870s. But the JR was going to make a comeback in the state in the 1880s, and it was going to be mostly African-American posts. There was one white GAR post in the 1880s, Vicksburg Post number 7. In fact, it was the very first one to open back up, but it was going to be followed by a large number of African-American posts spread throughout the state. And this is just a list of every GAR post in the state that I've been able to document and where they were located. And these names and post numbers are very important because in a lot of cases, this is how you're going to find information about the post your relative may have been a member of. The great thing about research now is you've got the internet, and you can do a search on like the Fred Douglass post in Mississippi, or post number 32 in Mississippi, and you can pull up all kinds of interesting material that's popped up on the internet just by searching the names of these various GAR posts. And again, this is another picture of the same picture of the Grand Army of the Republic and the Women's Relief Corps from Port Gibson celebrating Freedom Day in Claiborne County in 1890. And the JR, of course, had an auxiliary that was known as the National Women's Relief Corps. And you can see these ladies that are behind the veterans. They are a member of the National Women's Relief Corps. It was chartered in 1883, and its primary goal was to perpetuate the memory of those who fought for the Union in the Civil War. The Department of Louisiana and Mississippi of the Women's Relief Corps was organized March 28, 1893, but the first Mississippi chapters weren't organized until about 1900. And you will see them pop up in newspapers and other periodicals of the time, so you can sometimes follow their activities, particularly around important holidays. Particularly Memorial Day would probably be the most important one on the GAR and the Women's Relief Corps calendar. And then this is a list of the Women's Relief Corps chapters in Mississippi that I've been able to document. And again, you could go into it like a newspaper search engine and search for information on, say, R.B. Elliott post number 1 or ransom post number 9. And you will be able to find information on these posts, because I have found a number of newspaper articles that mention the activities of these various posts. And then this isn't specifically GAR, but the GAR was very involved in advocating for pensions for its members, and the Mississippi posts in the GAR did this as well. And if you had a relative that served in the Union Army from Mississippi, I would highly recommend checking to see if they have a pension. These pensions are at the National Archives. There are a number of search or indexes to these pensions, so you can check and see if your relative had one. If they did, it is well worth your time to get a copy of it, because those pensions are a wealth of information about the soldiers, not only about his time in the Army, but also his post-war life as well. And quite a lot of times there will be mentions of his service in the GAR that's made it into his pension application. In fact, a lot of times they'll have members of their post making affidavits for them, attesting to their Civil War service or any injuries they might have had in the war. So if you had a relative that was a veteran, definitely check to see if they filed for a pension after the war, because they're just a gold mine of information on that particular soldier. Now, every year, the Grand Army of the Republic held department and national encampments. These were elaborate, multi-day affairs that often included camping out, formal dinners, parades, memorial observances, and they also elected department and national officers at these meetings. And the great thing about them is they were very widely covered in the local newspapers. And the GAR itself would usually put out a book about the encampment as well. And a lot of Mississippians that were in the GAR would attend these events, and they were publicized. In fact, in this picture, there are several Mississippians shown attending a GAR reunion in Colorado. You have in this picture on the left John Ayers, who's a member of the Vandergrift Post in Summit. And then next to him is William Rochester, who was a member of one of the GAR posts in Natchez, and who also served as a department commander in the GAR. So it's well worth your while to look through the newspapers and look for information about these national encampments, because a lot of times you will find information about your local posts and the members from those posts who went to the national encampments. And now, I can't emphasize enough how important newspapers are to researching the GAR in Mississippi. Unfortunately, the post records that were kept by the individual posts, I don't know of any that have survived for a single one of the Mississippi posts. And so you have to go to secondary sources, and newspapers are going to be one of the best ones. Fortunately, there's a lot of digitized Mississippi newspapers out there. One of the first ones you should go to, the National Tribune, which is available online through the Library of Congress's Chronicling America program. This was the periodical of the Grand Army of the Republic, and a lot of Mississippi GAR members wrote into it. For example, this was a little article written by a member of the GAR who served in the 3rd United States Colored Cavalry, which was a unit raised from Mississippi. So you can very often find some really good information about GAR members from the state just from what they wrote into the National Tribune. They wrote in reminiscences, they printed obituaries for members. There's just all kinds of a wealth of information that can be found in the National Tribune, and the great thing about it, it is searchable. And then you might also want to search your local papers as well. A good example I found this through the pay site newspapers.com. This is an article about a Decoration Day celebration being held by R.B. Elliott Post number 17 of the Grand Army of the Republic, which is one of the posts that was in, this was the Women's Relief Corps post that was in Vicksburg. And the article briefly says, R.B. Elliott Post number 17, GAR, assisted by the Women's Relief Corps, GAR, has made arrangements to celebrate the customary ceremonies of Decoration Day at the National Cemetery and will decorate the graves. All the colored fraternal societies of the city are expected to take part in the parade, and several organizations in the adjacent towns have been invited. The procession will form at 9 a.m. at the corner of Jackson and Monroe Streets, and march thence to Washington by way of Jackson, Cherry, and South Streets, and then along Washington to the National Cemetery. The ceremonies will begin at 11 a.m. Ex-Alderman W.C. Creighton is Grand Marshal, and Jonathan S. Hayes and J.A. Jostle are the officers of the day. A large choir and several fine bands will render the ceremonies additionally imposing. And you'll find this kind of information quite often about the activities of your local JR posts. So it's well worth your time either going through a digitized newspaper, if they're available, or if they're not for your town, looking through either the microfilm or the actual copies of the paper, particularly around Memorial Day. That's when you're going to find the best chance of finding an article about the local GAR post is around Memorial Day. But the newspapers were pretty good about covering their activities. Here's another example. This is from a Vicksburg paper, the E.D. Edward Post, number 22, Vicksburg, Mississippi, January 1st, 1906. And they're writing to the mayor of Vicksburg. To his honor, the mayor of Vicksburg, we, the members of E.D. Edwards Post, number 22, GAR, desiring to celebrate the National Day of Emancipation of 4,648,000 slaves, humbly implore you in good faith to secure us protection for that day. Humbly yours, John Love, Commander, Wilson Turner, Adjutant, Robert Crane, Surgeon, and Trustee. So another thing that these ads are good for, when you fire these articles are good for, is a lot of times they're going to name a lot of the members that were participating in these activities, which is great because since there are no surviving rosters of the posts, a lot of times the only way you can figure out who was a member of a specific post is just to go through articles like this and note the names and see what post they belong to. So, you know, this kind of information could be very useful. And then another thing that can be very useful are the journals published by the Grand Army of the Republic itself. Like this is an example of one of the encampment journals. It was published for the National Encampment held in Detroit, Michigan in September 1914. And the great thing about it, in each of these journals, they'll list each of the individual departments and usually give all of the commanders of that within that department. So a lot of times you can find out who the members were by looking at one of these organizational tables. Now Mississippi was part of the department. It was known as the Department of Louisiana and Mississippi, as you can see right here. And it lists, of course, all of the officers. Like, for example, Junior Vice Department Commander William Rochester of Natchez. And so you can find a lot of information, not only about the officers, but also a lot of articles about the goings-on of what's going on in the individual posts in a department just by going through these journals. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been digitized. You can go to Google Books and just Google like Department of Louisiana and Mississippi, GAR, and you can pull up a lot of these various journals and read about the activities that your relatives would have been involved in. You can also find a lot of them on the website hathitrust.org. That's HATHITRUST.org. That's another excellent website for finding 19th and early 20th century documents that you can freely download and use. Yeah, it takes a lot of looking. The sources on JR members in Mississippi, it is sparse. There's not a ton of material. although we're constantly trying to find more. Another thing you might check, the Mississippi Department of Archives and History does have subject files on the various JAR posts in the state. So you might check with them to see what they have. This isn't a lot, but it's what there is, and you just have to make the most of what is available. This has been a short little episode simply because there's just not that many sources to go over. But if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them for me. I'll be glad to answer them. If you found this useful at all, please like and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already, because it really helps me gauge, how many people are viewing this and gives me an idea of how many I should be doing of these episodes. But I'll be back with you shortly with the next episode in researching your Mississippi ancestor. Hopefully I'll have it out by early next week. But thank you for watching, and have a great weekend.